Hi everyone, I'm Luke Platt. Specialization in youth sports has been growing for quite some time. I recently sat down with David Epstein, former senior writer for Sports Illustrated and author of the New York Times best-selling book Range, to discuss its impact on young athletes.
So, in your TED Talk, Why Specializing Early Doesn't Always Mean Career Success, you discuss the concepts of deliberate practice and sampling periods as very different early training approaches for elite athletes. Can you briefly explain those contrasting methods and how you think the increasing reliance on deliberate practice in youth sports today may help to undermine kids' long-term success?
Sure. So the deliberate practice framework, what most people know as the 10,000 hours rule, this idea that it takes 10,000 hours of practice, that's the only route really to become great at something, so that you should start as early as possible to rack up those 10,000 hours. Scientists actually call this the deliberate practice framework. And deliberate practice meaning practice that's like not playing around. It's like highly structured, focused on correcting errors, often coached, sort of technical and specialized. And so it's obviously, this idea has been incredibly influential, that you need a head start in that as quickly as possible. What the science actually shows, though, is that when athletes are tracked over the course of their development, those who end up becoming elite, there are a huge amount of individual variability, of course, but the typical path is actually, rather than getting that head start in deliberate practice, they have what scientists call a sampling period, where they do a variety of activities. Sometimes those are multiple sports, but they can also be things like dance and martial arts, rock climbing, surfing. Just they're diversifying their movement patterns and physical activities. And some of that, they're doing some deliberate practice in sports, but they're also doing sort of less structured activity, that's sometimes more led by them as opposed to a coach. And that leads them to gain these broader general skills, like what scientists sometimes call physical literacy, like just an ability to use your body in general. Those scaffold later technical skills later on. So you become a better learner if you have that sampling period early. And if you don't, you're less likely to learn skills later as quickly. They also learn more about their own abilities and what they like. And so they can pick a better fit when they pick a sport. And also there's sort of so I think, maybe I'm going on too long about it, but there's sort of three categories, I would say, where the sampling model outperforms the early specialization model. And those are in picking what you fit with, so-called match quality, that when you get to try more things, you end up picking a better fit. You become a better learner because you have this broader toolbox and physical literacy, so you're a better learner later on. And thirdly, you become more physically resistant and psychologically resistant to burnout. And so there's some really interesting work following youth athletes that shows that the best predictor of who would suffer an injury, that what's called an adult style overuse injury, meaning it might affect their entire career as a child, was if they're playing one sport and one sport only 9 or more months a year. And other athletes who were playing sports all year round, but were diversified, had some protective effect against those kinds of injuries. So it wasn't just about how much you're playing, but something to do with kind of diversifying your movement patterns. And those athletes tended to get psychologically burned out less. So it's those sort of three buckets.
Yeah. So, you said that we don't tend to incentivize anything that doesn't look like head start or specialization. And unfortunately, the incentive for many youth sports leagues has largely become monetary.
Yeah.
And as a result, has focused on the short term of its success of its players and its leagues in order to help the league's overall bottom line. So do you see a way to overcome the money incentive that is often behind the pressure put on parents from coaches or leagues to have their child only play one sport exclusively?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think you're definitely right. Like the place I lived before where I am now, I lived in Brooklyn, and there was a U8, I think it was, travel soccer team that met like at a park right near me. So these are like 7-year-olds, and I don't think anyone in the world thinks 7-year-olds can't find good enough competition in a city of 9 million people that they have to spend their time traveling, right?
Right.
But it's in the economic interest of the person running that league. And then they say, well, if you're not on the 7-year-old team, you can't be on the 8-year-old team, you can't be on the 9-year-old team, and so on and so forth. And I think in the United States, we haven't had to get good about sports development in a lot of ways because we have more athletes than everyone else. So like in my sport, I was a college track athlete, and the NCAA system supports like 30 to 40,000 young adults in pretty serious training. That might be more than the rest of the world combined. So we can do things poorly and still have, because we have this incredible talent funnel. But in other countries, some countries have overcome this. So I would say the best sports country in the world right now is Norway. Norway, in the last 2 Winter Olympics, for example, they won 2 Winter Olympics ago. I think they won more medals than like the US, China, and Germany combined, which were like the next best countries. In this last one, I'm pretty sure they won more than US and China combined again. They topped the medal table, but they're also doing well in summer sports, and they're winning things that you wouldn't associate with Norway, like beach volleyball, right? They won the gold medal in. They have like, the best miler in the world. They have the best 400-meter hurdler in the world. They have, golfer and some tennis players who are like rising up the ranks and things like that. And this is a tiny country. And they actually have a system where you're not allowed to start like ranking and tracking kids and keeping score before age 12. So coaches will get a penalty if they're caught doing that. And the reason they want that is because, one, they want people to spend time in these like more lightly structured environments. They want them to fall in love with what they're doing. They don't want them to be getting injuries from the time they're young. They want them to be trying a bunch of different things to see where they fit and gain those benefits we talked about. But also they want to keep the talent funnel very wide, right? Like when our youth sports system starts deselecting people like before they've even started puberty in a lot of cases. So you actually have no idea who that person is going to become. So there's this thing. Have you heard of the relative age effect?
No, I'm not familiar with that. No.
The relative age effect is this finding where if you look on a lot of youth sports teams, even up to like the good junior level, you'll see that the birthdays cluster in certain parts of the year. And that's because coaches at youth levels, when they look at kids and say this and this and this kid is the most talented, it turns out that what they're usually seeing is just the kid who is older. So like when you're selecting kids at age 8 or 9 or 10, if the selection year is, let's say, the calendar year, then a kid who was born in January, and a kid who was born in December, they may be the same chronological age, but they're effectively like a year different. And that's a huge difference when you're 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. And so these coaches think they're seeing potential, but what they're really seeing is just the kids who are relatively older. So the relative age effect is the name for this finding that a lot of these best youth teams will be populated by kids who were just born early in the selection year, because coaches at that age mistake, talent and potential for just biological maturation. And that's something that like countries like Norway really don't want. And so they delay selection much more, and they make a much better use of their talent pool.
Yeah, definitely. So how do those parents who kind of see natural potential in their child in a specific sport encourage sampling while still maintaining the busy schedules of practice, tournaments, and coaches' expectations of excelling in a particular area or sport?
Yeah, that's a great and tricky question. And I get that question from parents a lot. And I'm like really hesitant. I don't ever want to tell them, hey, just go outside the system, because you can't really do that. I mean, I'm a parent, and you can't tell someone to just like live outside of the institutions and society around them, right? Like just creating their own teams and stuff. So I don't think that's a realistic answer. I think hopefully we'll see some social change in general. And I think the fact that people like, you and like me, and I think there's like growing interest in what we're doing with youth sports. So I hope that'll change the systems. But given that that's often not available right now, I think there are ways to sort of split the difference. Like Andy and Jamie Murray's mom, Judy Murray, for example. I don't know if you follow tennis, but Andy and Jamie Murray are pro tennis players. And, Andy Murray, one of the maybe, I think that's probably the greatest tennis player from his country ever. And trying to think if I'm forgetting anybody and sticking my foot in my mouth there. But anyway, a great tennis player. And their mother, Judy Murray, runs a tennis camp in the UK. And there are like, the kids are playing tennis, but it's like they'll be playing, with a deflated ball through tree branches or something like that. Or they'll be playing on like a court that's a weird shape one day. And so it's like they're doing stuff that is tennis-like enough to appease the parents and the coaches, but they're also building in that movement variability. So because I don't think it's so much about like, are you playing basketball versus soccer? I think it's more about your movement variability and diversifying your physical problem solving. Because there's this famous finding in research on this topic called breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. Transfer is your ability to like take your skills and apply them to new situations. So in sports, that would be like as the game gets faster and the levels go up, you have to solve new problems. And your ability to do that is predicted by how broad the kind of training base you have, how many different types of problems you faced in training. So you want to diversify what the kids are up against. So I think you can kind of find happy mediums like that. And I think in soccer, futsal is sort of like that happy medium. Like if you go around Brazil, or Argentina, almost all of the players who go on to become pros are growing up playing futsal. They're not like learning how to run set plays and stuff, on a full size pitch. They're like futsal small ball, stays on the ground mostly. They're playing on like sand one day and cobblestones the next day, over nets. And so I think that's why that's such a good developmental sport. So in that case, you can say, well, someone's still, doing something soccer-like enough that if their parents are crazy about it, it's probably okay, but they're still capturing some of those benefits. So I think there's some sort of like middle ground solutions like that.
Yeah. So in your book, Range, you discussed both Roger Federer and Tiger Woods, who excelled in their given sports, but got there in very different ways. How do you think parents impact their children's psychological well-being by choosing or helping their child choose either a generalist or specialist approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's sort of two things that are important to touch on about that. The first is that parents are sort of always looking for the Tiger Woods, right? Like this super special kid and I would say research in this area on prodigies, whether it's like prodigies tend to only show up in a few areas that are like very rule bound, like playing classical music, chess, and golf are like the primary ones. And that's because those are such like repetitive pattern activities. And those kids, their parents don't need to look out for them. Those kids announce themselves. So like Tiger Woods was very physically precocious. And when his father first gave him a putter at 7 months old, he wasn't trying to teach him golf. It was a putter that he was done using, and he just gave it to him as like a toy. And then he noticed that Tiger was like very physically precocious and interested. Tiger himself said, I think it was a while ago, like in the early 2000s, he said, my father never once asked me to play golf. It was always me asking him, to let me play golf or bring me to play golf. And he said, it's the child's desire to play, not the parent's desire to have the child play. So those announcements, like those people like Mozart's, they like knock their parents out. It's not their parents manufacturing them. It's like their parents reacting to something very unusual. And so a parent doesn't really have to like wonder if they have a Tiger Woods or a Mozart, because those kids announce themselves. And then the question is, can the parent accommodate, that child's rage to master, so to speak? So I think for most parents, they'd be much better off, like if they have one of those kids, okay, deal with it and try to give them the opportunities that they're obviously burning for. But for most parents, I think you want to lay out, allow a kid to try different things, allow them to develop much more slowly, and just help them learn from each of those experiences. And that's where I think a parent can really be helpful, is in helping kids do what's called self-regulatory learning, which basically means thinking about your own thinking and learning. Or when you do something, say, what did I like about this, and what didn't I? What do I need to learn? How am I going to do that? Who do I need to help me do that? Like, what was I good at that I didn't expect? What was I bad at that I didn't expect? And you keep learning about yourself through each of these experiences, and they'll start to figure out how they need to learn skills more quickly, what they like about which sport or what they don't. And so I think that's a good approach to take, because the sort of forced prodigy model, it really doesn't work that well. Like one of the most influential accounts of this was the book Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, where this woman who's like a Yale professor, she raised these, she opens the book saying she's going to give you like the secrets to raising successful children. And the first page of the book was excerpted in the Wall Street Journal, and it was their most commented upon article ever. And on that page, she recounts like she assigned her daughter violin and had her do like 5 to 6 hours of deliberate practice a day. So of course, like with Tiger Woods, that launches this craze where other parents start doing that. but because that like stuck in the public consciousness. But later in the book, the part that people don't remember is her daughter turns to her as like a teenager and says, like, you picked this, not me. I quit, and quits. Right? Nobody remembers that part, but that's what the research says typically happens in these scenarios. Even when someone's really good, there's a famous tennis study that included a number of like 10 players who went on to become world top 100 and looked at their upbringing. It was in Sweden, and basically what it found was when kids showed a lot of talent when they were young, somebody would identify them and say like, oh man, this kid's really talented, and take them from what the researchers call into what the researchers called a more restrictive environment, meaning whatever this kid was doing was working and they were enjoying it. And then someone identifies them as talented and says like, oh, now you have to come do this other thing that's like much more, not what was working for you here, but you have to develop much faster in a much more technical way. And most of them end up quitting. The 10 kids in that study that went on to become top world 100, none of them were identified early. So they were able to develop, and it was especially the case for girls. If they were identified as talented, they would get moved into this very restrictive environment, and basically every one of them would quit by 17. And so I think that's something to be really wary of. Even this is the last thing I'll leave you with. I was talking about some of this sports on this topic. I was talking about some of this sports data with a small group once, and Serena Williams comes and sits down in the second row, and I'm like freaking out because, you can have all the data you want in the world, and if the GOAT stands up and says you're an idiot, like it's going to be a bad day. And so I'm like just sweating, like, please don't let her ask a question after this. And she stands up to, ask for the mic for the first question and says, I think my father was ahead of his time. He had us do ballet and gymnastics and taekwondo and track and field, and learn how to throw a football like overhand for the snapping motion for the serve. And when the junior tour got too intense, he took us off so we could also focus on school and all this stuff. I was, in the past, I was a senior writer at Sports Illustrated. I'd never heard that story. And so I think even the stories that we think are tiger stories often look a lot more complicated when we dig deeper into them.
Yeah. So for my last question, I'm just going to shift gears here real quick. We're often told that having that direct line of experience is what hiring managers are looking for. But you highlighted how innovators, people who are really changing the world and helping humanity, tend to have zigzag paths. What message can you share with UNLV, my classmates, as we work towards the next level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think more and more companies are kind of realizing that it's harder to hire for someone who's like super narrowly specialized. And we need specialists and generalists, like no question about it. But then in some ways it's becoming harder to hire people that are really narrow because the work world is changing so quickly that really you need to hire people that are ready to learn and relearn. And so that you need this, whether they're a specialist or a generalist, they're going to need to, broaden what I call their range. And so I think for people at your stage of life, or career, you can't really go wrong with the first thing you do. Don't worry too much about like your first jobs, because the most important thing about them are like dive into it and then have a reflection journal. Ask yourself constantly, what about this is meeting my expectations? What am I good at that I didn't expect? What am I bad at that I didn't expect? What do I want to learn and why? Am I sure I want to learn it? What do I need to do that? Who do I need to help me do that? Fill that out like every month. And the most important thing early in your career is learning about yourself, and how you best work and where you best fit. So no matter what your job is, you can learn stuff about that. And at your age, I think also, how old are you?
21.
So at your age, I think it's good to be aware of this psychology finding called the end of history illusion. And what this is this finding that if you ask people, have you learned a lot and changed a lot, based on the things you've experienced in your life, everyone says, yeah, of course I have. But then if you ask them, are you going to change as much in the future? I say, no, now I think I'm pretty much done. And it turns out we underestimate future change at every time point in life. How we want to spend our time, what we think our strengths are, the values we have for the world, what we admire in friends, all these things, they change more than we think. And the fastest time of personality change is about 18 to your late 20s. So it never stops, but you're right in the middle of the super fast change time. And so if you're thinking like, I need to have figured out what I'm going to be doing for the next 50 or 60 years, like you're trying to choose for a person who doesn't exist yet in a world that doesn't exist yet. Because a lot of the jobs that people your age are going to spend a lot of time in don't exist yet, or don't look like what they're going to look like when you get out there. So I think you need to be conscious of keep updating, keep learning about yourself. Don't think you need to find this singular path, because that's like not how the work world is anymore. And the most important thing is that every stop you make, whether it's a good fit for you or not, maximize your self-knowledge and use that to pivot to the next stop. So you should be self-learning oriented, not like I need to find my calling oriented. If you do happen to get lucky and fall into your calling, great. But that's not going to be the case for most people.